These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. In 1869, crowds in New York paid to see the Cardiff Giant, a supposed 3-meter-tall fossil man dug up on a farm. It was actually a gypsum statue secretly carved in Chicago for George Hull, who buried it a year earlier to create a money-making sensation. During the German hyperinflation of 1923, whole tubs of banknotes were collected because the paper was worth more than the money itself. People used bundles of cash as fuel or even threw them away like trash, while prices in shops could change several times in a single day. Red Army soldiers pose on a damaged armored train, its turret scarred by a direct hit, and a coffin with their fallen gunner resting on top. Armored trains like this became roaming forts during the Russian Civil War, bringing heavy guns and crews straight onto the railway front. Millie and Christine McCoy were born conjoined in North Carolina in 1851 and were sold 3 times as children before gaining freedom in 1863. Instead of hiding, they learned 5 languages, became famous singers who played piano together on one instrument. A U.S. Navy crew lifts a sunken F-14A Tomcat from the sea after a carrier accident. Such jets were often raised quickly, so their advanced radar and long-range missile systems did not fall into foreign hands. During the Second World War, armies ran delousing stations where people were covered with powder to get rid of lice. The white cloud in this photo is DDT being sprayed on a boy's hair, a quick solution that was later found to be dangerous for health and nature. Soviet soldiers stand around a mound of ash at the Majdanek camp in 1944, seeing for the first time what had happened there. Majdanek became one of the first camps where Allied teams collected hard proof that was later used in war crime trials. In 1937, photographer John Cowles convinced his brother and a friend to carry a full picnic setup onto the tip of Balanced Rock for this dizzying shot. The risky photo sat hidden for 19 years until Life magazine finally printed it in March 1956 as Precarious Place for a Picnic. This bare cell in Nuremberg held Hermann Göring during the post-war trials. He died here in October 1946, just 2 hours before his sentence was to be carried out, surprising the guards who were already preparing. In mid-1900s, Vico, Kentucky, whole communities gathered at the creek to watch baptisms like this one. For many mountain families, it was both a sacred moment and a rare social event that brought neighbors from all along the valley together. Elder Tom, photographed in Fiji in 1905 at about 80 years old, said he was the last man raised under the island's old victory feast traditions. A German Focke-Wulf 190 fighter flashes past a falling line of bombs dropped by an American B-26 Marauder during World War II. The pilot is so close to the drop that a small change in speed or height could have put the plane inside the blast zone. In April 1945, American troops entered Dachau and faced long lines of prisoners who had survived years of forced labor. Many of these men later shared detailed testimony, turning their memories of this day into key evidence for post-war trials. In the early 1900s, couples like this often lived in places where the law and neighbors tried to stop mixed-race marriage. Just standing together for a photo on the porch was a quiet act of courage that challenged the rules of their time. In the summer of 1892, Princess Pauline von Metternich and Countess Anastasia Kielmansegg agreed to a duel in Vienna after a fierce argument over flower decorations for a theater exhibition. They faced each other with swords under rules written by a woman doctor. During the Korean War, thousands of civilians from North Korea crossed open fields and rivers like this to escape the advancing front lines. Many carried everything they owned on their backs, joining one of the largest refugee movements in East Asia in the 20th century. In the 1920s, the Dassler brothers opened a small shoe factory in Herzogenaurach, Germany, the beginning of what later became Adidas. Like many business owners who wanted work with the regime, they joined the ruling party of 1930s Germany, a connection the company has had to address many times since. A late 19th century postcard from Zanzibar shows porters carrying a single elephant tusk that weighs more than 200 pounds. Massive tusks like this were shipped through the island's busy ports to overseas luxury markets, making Zanzibar a major ivory hub in East Africa. In 1979, the L&N Railroad gave its abandoned Amqui station to Johnny Cash, who loved trains so much he had the entire 68-year-old depot loaded onto trucks. He moved the wooden building to his land near Hendersonville, Tennessee, turning a forgotten station into a personal landmark. Russian divers in heavy copper suits descend through holes in the ice to work on the Yenisei River Bridge in 1896. These underwater crews helped anchor one of the key bridges of the new Trans-Siberian Railway in freezing, risky conditions. In the late 1950s, American families lined up in their cars for fast drive through polio shots, turning parking lots into temporary clinics. For many parents, this short stop meant their children would never face the paralyzing disease that had haunted earlier generations. In 1988, the Soviet patrol ship Bezavetny deliberately bumped the American cruiser USS Yorktown during a Black Sea encounter off Crimea. The maneuver was meant to force the U.S. ship out of waters claimed by Moscow, while Washington was testing its right of free passage under international law. This vintage Kentucky Fried Chicken menu from the 1960s shows a snack box for only 85 cents and a full dinner box for $1.35. Adjusted for today's money, that cheap roadside chicken would cost several times more. A Soviet SB bomber plunges toward the ground above a bridge over the Berezina River in 1941, caught at the exact moment of its fall. Scenes like this were common in the chaotic first months of the Eastern Front, as Soviet crews tried to slow the rapid advance of German forces. In 1916, the fishing boat New England returned to port in British Columbia, so coated in sea ice that the railings looked carved from marble. Crews on ships like this had to smash ice off the deck with axes because too much frozen weight could flip the boat in an instant. On 14th May 1986, the supertanker Seawise Giant, loaded with Iranian oil, burned in the Gulf after an air attack by Iraqi jets. The wreck was later repaired and the ship returned to service, becoming one of the largest moving objects humans have ever built. This early McDonald's menu shows a hamburger for 15 cents and fries or a drink for just 10 cents. In the 1950s, the chain sold only a few simple items, long before Big Macs and huge menus took over fast food. Union soldiers under General Sherman Heat and Twist railroad tracks outside Atlanta in 1864, turning them into the famous Sherman's neckties. Destroying the rails this way helped cut supply lines and clear the path for his march across Georgia. In May 1922, an oil well accident near Norphlet, Arkansas, tore open this huge crater, about 450 feet wide and 50 feet deep. Curious locals rushed to the rim to stare at the churning mud and gas where a drilling rig had stood only hours before. A heavy machine gun crew under Sergeant Fyodor Konoplyev fires bright tracer rounds at enemy aircraft over the Neva River in Leningrad, October 1942. During the long siege, improvised river barges like this became floating anti-air posts, guarding the starving city from night raids. A British soldier shows off a knitted vest that doubles as a checkerboard, made for long off-duty hours from 1914 to 1918. Such clever clothing let troops play games anywhere, using buttons or coins as pieces to keep their minds busy. King George VI inspects kilted officers of the 5th Battalion, Highland Light Infantry, during a snowstorm in Gorhambury Park, Hertfordshire, on 29 February 1944. Just months before D-Day, these men trained for European operations while standing at attention in freezing wind like this. Belgian soldiers lie in the roadside dust defending Liège in the first weeks of World War I. The forts and rifle lines around this city delayed the German advance by almost 2 weeks, buying precious time for France and Britain to mobilize. American soldiers from the 1340th Engineer Battalion dig up potatoes near Hürtgen, Germany in 1944, turning a battlefield into a sudden farm. In the long Hürtgen Forest campaign, units often relied on local crops like this to stretch rations and keep moving. Austro-Hungarian soldiers in a Budapest hospital practice, walking with new wooden legs during the First World War. Simple rails on the ground acted as a training track, part of early attempts at organized rehabilitation for thousands of wounded veterans. In June 1945, teenage girls on the Ryukyu Islands were drilled to use machine guns as Japan prepared desperate defenses against an expected invasion. Many of these students had come straight from school desks to the firing line. In 1937, a Japanese soldier stands guard on a captured stretch of the Great Wall of China during early fighting in North China. For Tokyo, stationing men and flags on this ancient landmark was a way to show control as their campaign pushed deeper inland. Soviet paratroopers in white winter suits climb into a transport plane in 1942, each carrying a Mosin carbine on his back. Their snow gear and simple weapons had to be enough for risky jumps behind the lines in freezing weather. In 1897, two Klondike prospectors sit on a porch with bags of gold dust washed from a single claim in just 15 days. During the gold rush, lucky strikes like this turned rough camps into instant banks as miners carried fortunes in cloth sacks instead of wallets. After Abraham Lincoln was shot in 1865, investigators collected these pistols, knives, and even the bullet removed from his head as evidence. The boots on the left belonged to John Wilkes Booth and were taken from him the day of the attack, along with weapons seized from his accomplices. In 1924, rural villagers sit in the dark, their faces washed in projector light as they watch a film for the very first time. Traveling cinema crews brought reels, a generator, and a noisy projector to remote villages like this. A caretaker's wife hangs laundry in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty on Liberty Island in the 1930s. For families who lived in the service buildings here, one of the world's most famous monuments was literally their backyard neighbor. An armed member of the Japanese Red Army leads two hostages through the streets of Kuala Lumpur on 7 August 1975 during a high-profile office building siege. The tense standoff ended through negotiations and a prisoner exchange. Young Soviet athletes march bare-chested across Red Square during the All-Union Fitness Parade of 1937. Events like this mixed sport with politics, turning long lines of trained bodies into a living symbol of national strength. In 1943, Allied troops on Kiska Island found Japanese mini-submarines and heavy gear abandoned on the rails after a secret evacuation. The landing force had prepared for a major battle, but the base was empty, and most losses came instead from fog, confusion, and hidden traps. Tsar Nicholas II and his son Alexei visit a forward trench on the Eastern Front during the First World War. Only a few years later, both would be swept away with the fall of the Russian monarchy. Ordinary townspeople known as meshochniki ride in freight cars across Russia in 1919, their sacks filled with food and goods for trading. They bartered whatever they could find to get through the chaos of the Civil War, often spending days in crowded, unheated wagons. Shipyard workers stand inside the torn hull of a warship, examining the round scar where an underwater weapon struck. The blast has peeled thick steel plates back like paper, showing how a single hit below the waterline can cripple thousands of tons of metal. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara march side by side during a street parade in Havana, Cuba, March 1960. Within a few years, images from days like this turned Che's face and Fidel's beard into some of the most printed portraits of the 20th century. In 1939, engineer Ferdinand Porsche unveiled two early Volkswagen People's cars at a grand state celebration in Germany. These prototypes previewed the shape of the future Beetle, a small car designed so almost any family could afford one. A woman in the Netherlands in 1940 rolls tight balls of old newspaper, then lays them out to dry on her balcony. When winter coal ran short during the war, families burned these homemade paper bricks as their main heating fuel. A German Army correspondent interviews a captured Red Army soldier in the summer of 1941, while an entire squad crowds around to listen. Reports from talks like this were turned into leaflets and radio stories meant to weaken the enemy's will to keep fighting. In 1943, this B-17 Flying Fortress limped home with a huge section of its tail torn away after a German fighter rammed it. The crew still managed to land the crippled bomber, proving how tough the design really was. In 1996, Cuban leader Fidel Castro jokingly offers his beard as a target, while Muhammad Ali feints a light punch for the cameras. The two world icons spent the visit trading stories about sport and struggle, delighting the reporters crowded around them. French resistance fighters crouch at a Paris window in August 1944, holding fuel-filled bottles as they watch German positions near Notre Dame. During the city's liberation, small underground groups like theirs turned ordinary apartments into hidden strongpoints, overlooking famous landmarks. Russian soldiers test Professor Zelensky's new protective mask in the snow during the winter of 1914-1915. Its charcoal filter worked so well that similar designs were soon adopted by armies all over the world. For his 70th birthday, stunt diver Henry Lamotte climbed a high ladder in the city and jumped 15 meters into a simple barrel of water. He had been doing this act since the early 1900s, and crowds still filled the street to watch him drop and splash safely into the tiny tub. In spring 1908, Moscow's Bolshaya Polyanka Street turned into a shallow river after heavy flooding from the nearby river. Horse carts ferried people past shoe shops and gas lamps as the city's main road briefly became a canal. Two women in Central Asia stand wrapped in heavy traditional veils that cover them from head to toe, leaving only dark openings where faces should be. Such garments, once common in cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, were later pushed aside by reforms that urged women to step into public life unveiled. In 1928, passengers at Piccadilly Circus Station could watch these circular counters track every train on each underground line in real time. The moving pointers turned the timetable itself into a little mechanical show called See How They Run. On the set of The Fifth Element in the mid-1990s, Mila Jovovich relaxes in Lilu's famous white bandage outfit between takes. This simple corridor and quirky sci-fi costume would soon become one of the most recognizable looks in modern space cinema. Soviet T-62 tanks of the 101st Training Regiment practiced swimming along a flooded canal in East Germany. Cold War crews learned to seal the hatches, raise snorkels, and drive blind underwater so armor could cross rivers without bridges. In 1928, a giant python in a U.S. zoo refused food for weeks, so keepers staged this bizarre public hunger strike solution. While staff held the snake in a line like a living rope, another worker pushed prepared rabbits into its mouth to keep the expensive attraction alive. In 1973, after the military takeover in Chile, Santiago's National Stadium was turned into a vast improvised prison where thousands of suspected opponents were held under armed guard. For weeks, the football arena echoed not with cheers, but with roll calls. During the 1994 crisis in Rwanda, a detainee in Kigali reaches under the heavy wooden door of his crowded cell, feeling for a way to slide the bolt. That year, city jails overflowed, with thousands swept up in mass arrests as the country tore itself apart. A Meiji-era tobacconist in Japan poses beside an almost scientific display of pipes, pouches, flints, and tiny tools for preparing finely cut leaf. In the 1870s, such stalls functioned as early convenience stores, where regular customers could chat, refill their tobacco. On the set of the 1958 sci-fi film The Fly, David Hedison sits in his huge insect mask while Patricia Owens chats with him between takes. The hot, heavy costume helped turn this low-budget production into one of the era's most famous creature movies. On a snowy rail yard in Przemysl in early 1940, Soviet workers pump oil products into German tank cars along the new Soviet-German border. Under the secret clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the USSR shipped millions of tons of fuel. The U.S. Army built a fake suburb called Survival Town in the Nevada desert to see how ordinary houses would handle powerful blast waves. After one detonation, this two-story test home stood half-ruined and scorched, its mannequins and furniture inside examined like a real family's fate. Workers swarm around the giant hull of the steamship Great Eastern in Millwall, London, 1857. So huge it was 5 times larger than any ship afloat, and powered by both paddle wheels and a screw propeller. February 1916. School children in Pont-à-Mousson, France line up in protective masks, their town only a few kilometers from the Western Front. Even classes included emergency drills because artillery shells with chemical clouds could arrive without warning. A water carrier in Old Tiflis hauls a full barrel of drinking water on his back up an icy courtyard around the 1900s. Before modern pipes, thousands of city residents depended on men like him to bring every bucket of clean water to their homes. Smoke hangs over Vitebsk in July 1941, hours after German forces captured the city on the Eastern Front. Whole districts are still burning as ruined bridges, factories, and rail lines mark the chaos of the first weeks of the invasion. John F. Kennedy rides through Mexico City under a blizzard of confetti during his state visit in June 1962. The crowd packed the route so tightly that city crews later hauled away hundreds of tons of paper from the celebration. American GIs in Bohemia hoist an enormous glass of Pilsner beer with local villagers to celebrate the end of the war in Europe, 1945. In liberated Pilsen, breweries rushed to tap special victory kegs for the soldiers who had just arrived from the front lines. Soviet soldiers stand amid mountains of captured German rifles, carefully writing down serial numbers after the war in 1945. So much equipment was surrendered that former battlefields briefly turned into open-air warehouses of stacked weapons. A Soviet BTD armored rail car with a recycled T-26 tank turret rumbles along a forested track on the Leningrad front, 2 June 1942. These improvised rail tanks protected vital supply lines and could rush artillery support to any threatened sector that still had rails. A young vendor sits in the middle of a carpet made of wrenches, gears, bolts, and handmade parts, turning his stall into a metal mosaic. Mechanics and tinkerers can rebuild half a city from treasures found on a single blanket like this. Australian troops hug the sand as an abandoned German Panzer III is hit in the Egyptian desert, 11 May 1942. The blast turned the tank into a brief fireball landmark on the shifting North African front. Dozens of working elephants march in a grand parade through Dhaka, Bengal, British India around 1900. Such processions showcase the region's elephant power for transport, logging, and royal-style ceremonies. Tokyo after the night firebombing raid of $10 March 1945. Whole districts are reduced to ash with only the street grid and a few concrete buildings still visible. In a few hours, the attack destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes, making it one of the most devastating air raids in history. Early gyms promised effortless slimming with vibrating belt machines, like this one in New York, 1930. Women stood still while the belt shook their waist, a trendy, science-based shortcut to losing inches without breaking a sweat. This grainy team portrait shows one of the earliest England national football squads, photographed on 4th of March 1876. Their lace-up boots, heavy wool kits, and formal poses come from an era when football was still closer to a gentleman's pastime than a global sport. German stormtroopers test some of the first steel body armor plates designed to protect them from shrapnel and sniper fire on the Western Front. The suit weighed around 18 to 20 kg, so many soldiers wore it only for short assaults or sentries instead of long marches. A naval firefighter in a full-body asbestos suit tests a high-pressure hose aboard the British aircraft carrier HMS Victorious in Icelandic waters, November 1941. These bulky spacesuits let sailors work just meters from burning aviation fuel on the flight deck at the cost of serious long-term asbestos exposure. Engineers test the impact resistance of a gas mask lens with a hammer in 1932. The glass crazes but does not shatter, keeping the mask sealed against dangerous fumes. British officers stand beside a massive 800mm Dora railway cannon shell and its separate propellant charge in 1945. Each shell weighed over 7 tons and could be launched more than 40 km, making it one of the largest artillery pieces ever built. German POWs of the Wehrmacht receive official wages in a Soviet labor camp, where even privates and junior NCOs were paid 7 rubles a month and generals 30. Those who overfulfilled work quotas could earn bonuses up to 100 rubles, turning forced labor into a tightly regulated Soviet payroll system. The liner RMS Olympic shows a huge tear in her hull after colliding with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke off the Isle of Wight in September 1911. At the time, she was under Captain Edward Smith, whose later command of the Titanic gives this earlier accident an eerie historical connection. Toronto Maple Leafs players march into mock trenches in full-team sweaters during a 1939 military training session at a machine gun range. Over the next few years, more than 100 NHL players would swap hockey gear for uniforms, turning sports stars into temporary soldiers. During World War II, Britain's strict food rationing quietly turned into a national health experiment. With everyone limited to modest but balanced rations, life expectancy rose and infant deaths fell as people ate more evenly and cut back on excess. In 1894, Thomas Edison filmed 2 cats boxing in a miniature ring, creating what's considered the first ever cat video. The 20-second clip was shot for his kinetoscope parlor, meaning cat content on screen is older than most fast food classics. For the Wizard of Oz tornado, the crew built a 35-foot muslin stocking, filled it with dust, and hung it from a crane to whirl across a miniature Kansas farm. Filmed in 1939 with no CGI, this low-tech trick still beats many modern storm effects. In 1854, activists crowded into this small schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin to form the new Republican Party, united against expanding slavery into America's western territories. Within a decade, their anti-slavery coalition helped elect Abraham Lincoln and transform the country's politics. Jewish refugees crowd the deck of a ship bound for British-controlled Palestine, holding a banner that reads, "The Germans destroyed our families. Don't you destroy our hopes." For many survivors, this risky voyage was a last attempt to reach a place where they could rebuild a normal life. In World War II, some POW camps in Canada were so comfortable, with good food, classes, and even hockey, that inmates jokingly called them the Fritz Hilton. After the war, thousands of these former prisoners applied to return and settle in Canada rather than go back home. In 1939, France built a single experimental 8-wheeled armored car, the Panhard AM-40P, which could reach 80 km/h and carried a 25mm cannon with 60 frontal armor. To keep it from German hands, the prototype was shipped to Morocco and later lost. Outside Elvis Presley's Graceland, Aloha Johnson and her daughter-in-law protest a lenient sentence for a repeat traffic offender whose car cost her 19-year-old daughter and another young woman their lives. They traveled from Monroe, Louisiana, to confront Memphis authorities during the all-night vigil held by Elvis fans after his passing in 1977. July 9, 1918, 2 packed passenger trains collided head-on at Dutchman's Curve near Nashville, creating one of the deadliest rail disasters in U.S. history. In the wreckage, rescuers found a soldier who had thrown himself over a stranger's child. The man gone, but the child still breathing beneath his arm. In the 1950s, Pan Am flight attendants worked in full stainless steel galleys, plating multi-course meals by hand like a tiny restaurant in the sky. On long transoceanic routes, they could roast meat, chill champagne, and serve passengers on real china at 5 miles altitude. In 1879, this lonely farmhouse sat on a rocky hill where 84th Street meets Broadway in today's Manhattan. Within a few decades, the fields and dirt road around it were replaced by apartment blocks, subway lines, and one of New York's busiest intersections. In 1911, this Southern Ohio family proudly posed with their high-tech, gasoline-powered washing machine, a luxury that could cost nearly a month's wages. Machines like this turned wash day from a dawn to dark chore into a few noisy hours of cranking and rinsing. Children play outside a crumbling doorway on Cumberland Street, one of Dublin's overcrowded slum areas in the 1940s. Many families here lived without indoor plumbing or heating, with several kids sharing a single tiny room. Families once lived in these tiny stone houses on the remote island of St. Kilda, Scotland, cut off for days by rough Atlantic seas. The village was abandoned in 1930, and today the restored cottages survive as a frozen snapshot of island life. In 1930, the magazine Modern Mechanics showed readers how to turn their hands into shadow animals, from doves and cats to spiders and elephants. Before home television, simple tricks like these gave families their own night show on the wall. Swedish schoolchildren turned their 1901 playground into a huge snowball fight outside a wooden village schoolhouse. Early school photos were usually stiff-posed portraits, so this chaotic rush through the snow is a rare glimpse of real recess. A line of very young coal workers stands by the sorting belts in a mine near Lens in northern France, around the early 1900s. The postcard even prints a poem by minor poet Jules Mousseron, turning their daily shift into a proud symbol of the coal town. Miners at Monceau-les-Mines stand with their metal lamps as the lift cage arrives to take them underground in early 20th century France. These sturdy lamps were their only light and early warning in the deep and narrow tunnels below. On a spring day in 1953, British children stampede into a candy shop the moment sweet rationing is finally lifted. After 14 years of strict food limits, this sugar rush felt like a tiny national holiday for kids. In 1910, an Appalachian family in Pike County, Kentucky stands barefoot in front of their small wooden house for the camera. Big families like this often shared work on the same hillside farms and nearby coal jobs to keep their home going. In the Arkansas oil boom town of Smackover, even sturdy Ford cars sank into the deep mud of the oilfield roads. Horse-drawn wagons line up beside the stuck car, showing how old transport could beat new machines in rough country. In 1922, an oil well near Smackover in Union County, Arkansas, shoots a dark plume into the sky and announces a new boomtown. By 1925, this quiet place had jumped from 131 residents to about 25,000, as the Smackover Pool briefly became the biggest oil-producing site on Earth. In 1913, newly elected Arkansas Governor George W. Hayes rides into his hometown of Camden as the first train pulls into the brand-new Missouri Pacific Depot. Townspeople crowd the tracks, gathering around his car and horses to greet the local man who made it to the State House. In 1936, a striped prison road crew in North Carolina digs and loads dirt to build a new state highway. During the 1930s, many rural southern roads were built almost entirely by such inmate work gangs. In 1928, newlyweds Glenn and Bessie Hyde set off to raft the Grand Canyon, and their empty boat was later found floating in good shape, while the couple was never found. Decades later, an elderly woman at a campfire calmly claimed she was Bessie Hyde, turning the unsolved river journey into one of the canyon's strangest legends. On April 18, 1912, the ship Carpathia reached New York with Titanic lifeboats hanging along her side at Pier 59. The small boats, lowered before docking at Pier 54, became silent proof of the most famous ocean rescue of the early 20th century. Horse-drawn carts roll slowly along the main street of Blackrock, County Dublin in the late 19th century. The muddy tracks, gas lamps, and distant church tower show a seaside town caught between old village life and the coming modern city of Dublin. Sailors of the French armored cruiser Admiral Aube work a makeshift forge on deck in 1917, hammering hot metal on anvil blocks. On long wartime cruises, crews like this had to repair their own ship hardware at sea, turning part of the deck into a floating workshop. On 26 October 1967, residents of Hanoi pull injured United States Navy pilot John McCain onto a float in Truc Bac Lake after his Skyhawk jet crashes into the water. He would spend years in captivity in North Vietnam. Children in northern Sierra Leone hold up freshly caught bats in 1968, a common source of protein in rural West Africa. For many villages, hunting bats in nearby caves and cliffs was part food supply and part rite of passage for the boys. In 1934, Soviet schoolchildren march in homemade bird masks during a demonstration to protect useful birds that saved crops from pests. The posters show how many harmful insects each species could eat in a year, turning science class into a costume street campaign. In 1940, Soviet Ambassador Ivan Maisky sits in the London embassy shelter with his staff, calmly reading a newspaper during an air raid. In the nights of the Blitz, many foreign diplomats worked like this underground, holding meetings in narrow bunkers below the city. In 1941, General Charles de Gaulle climbs out of a Free French Navy submarine during an inspection in wartime exile. From bases like this, his small underwater fleet kept the Free France flag alive at sea while the homeland was occupied. In August 1941, residents of Odessa pile sandbags, logs, and scrap metal into a street barricade to block advancing German and Romanian forces. For weeks, ordinary workers turned whole city blocks into layered walls, preparing their port for a long siege. An American-made M3 Lee medium tank from the Soviet 193rd Separate Tank Regiment sits in the woods on the Central Front during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. These tall, riveted machines came to the Red Army through Lend-Lease and fought alongside Soviet designs in the largest tank clash of the war. Around 1909, about 100 new landowners stand in a circle on empty sand dunes near Jaffa, drawing lots to divide the plots that will become Tel Aviv. Within a few years, the same dunes are filled with rising concrete houses and camels hauling building supplies along the new streets. French Saint-Chamond heavy tanks advance in a line across open ground during the First World War. Their long hulls carried a powerful gun but often got stuck on trenches, making them one of the strangest early tank designs. In 1944, an Orthodox priest in Moldova raises a cross to bless a column of Red Army officers and soldiers as they march past his village. Scenes like this, rare on camera, show how faith and the Soviet war effort sometimes met on the same dirt road. Two Afghan fighters pose in 1879 with long matchlock rifles and curved blades, their clothes packed with powder flasks and tools. The kneeling man rests his heavy gun on a forked stick, an old style of shooting that survived even as modern rifles spread across Asia. A German air gunner braces in the belly position of a Heinkel He-111 bomber in 1940, gripping his weapon while the plane is in flight. The cramped glass gondola under the fuselage gave a wide view of the sky but left the crewman exposed and alone. In March 1936, a mother and her children stand barefoot by Highway 70 near the Tennessee River, wearing dresses and overalls cut from old sacks. During the Great Depression, many large families lived beside the road like this, moving from farm to farm in search of seasonal work. In September 1944, a captured German soldier is marched through the streets of Saint-Michel, France, by members of the local resistance. Crowds press in close, and one woman leans forward to shout in his face, a brief moment of payback after 4 years of occupation. In 1955, a 7-year-old boy in the Bronx leans close to his television as a live broadcast shows a towering nuclear test cloud. For many children of the early Cold War, scenes like this were normal TV viewing, blending science lessons with a strange sense of danger in the living room. In Moscow in 1959, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and United States Vice President Richard Nixon lean over a railing during the famous kitchen debate at the American National Exhibition. Their lively back and forth over whose everyday life was better, Soviet or American, briefly turned a model kitchen into a global stage. In 1918, captured German planes are hauled through crowded London streets as trophies of the end of the Great War. Huge, cheering crowds pack the corners to see the once feared machines roll past as harmless parade floats. In 1937, Japanese naval infantry wave rifles and a rising sun banner amid shattered buildings as they celebrate taking Shanghai. The image turns a fierce urban campaign into a tightly packed scene of victory for Homefront newsreels. This clever Cape Times advertisement imagines Jacqueline Kennedy taking a close-up selfie with John F. Kennedy in the back of their car. Teenager Harry Fowles poses for a police photo as a member of the real Peaky Blinders youth gang in Birmingham in the early 1900s. The sharp-peaked caps that gave the group its name became so well known that later street gangs copied the style long after this crew vanished. Around 1850, a group of men sit at a small table playing cards with mugs of drink in one of the earliest candid-style tavern photos. Early cameras needed long exposures, so relaxed scenes like this were rare and often carefully staged. In 1857, engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel and a crowd of top-hatted onlookers watched the launch of the all-metal steamship Leviathan, later called Great Eastern. At more than 200 meters long, it was the largest ship ever built at the time and looked almost unreal beside the men who designed it. Persian diplomat Farrokh Khan Amin O'Dowleh sits for a portrait in 1857, wearing an ornate robe and towering hat during his mission to Europe. As ambassador to Napoleon III and Queen Victoria, he became one of the first Persian envoys to be widely photographed in Western courts. In the 1930s, Soviet paratroopers sit strapped along the corrugated wings and spine of a TB-3 bomber ready to take off into the air. The USSR was experimenting with some of the world's first large-scale airborne units, even carrying light guns and tiny tanks on planes like this. In 1919, a White Army artilleryman poses on the gun platform of an armored train, holding a shell almost as tall as he is. Armored trains like this rumbled along Russia's rail lines during the Civil War, acting as mobile forts with heavy guns on steel wheels. In 1941, German soldiers gather around a captured concrete bunker of the Kiev fortified line, spreading maps and radio gear on the ground. The Soviet star, still painted on the wall behind them, shows how quickly front lines moved in the first summer of the Eastern Campaign. In the late 1940s, women in Nuremberg cook on a makeshift brick stove set up among the rubble of shattered buildings. With shops gone and homes damaged, many families turned ruins into open-air kitchens just to get a hot meal. In 1943, Free French pilots of the Normandy Niemen Squadron crouch under the wing of Roland de la Poip's shark-mouthed Yak 1 to squeeze in a chess game between flights. This small unit would go on to claim over 200 confirmed aerial victories while flying alongside Soviet allies. In 1885, a small group of Russian settlers trudges toward Siberia, carrying everything they own on their backs in search of better land. Their layered rags, walking sticks, and covered faces show how hard the journey was long before they reached their new home. In autumn 1941, a small village near Kursk is turned into a forest of German road signs pointing to units, depots, and a field hospital. The cluttered arrows show how completely the Army mapped and labeled every corner of the occupied area. In 1958, a museum artist carefully positions a giant model millipede on oversized leaves for a new exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History. Such hand-built sets helped visitors imagine how huge some ancient forest creatures once were. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie walked toward their car in Sarajevo, unaware that this routine visit will soon end in a fatal attack. Just minutes after this scene, gunfire on the street triggered the crisis that spiraled into the First World War. In 1939, German and Soviet officers stand together in a forest clearing as fresh border posts mark the new line agreed between their states. For a short time before they turned on each other, this quiet spot was the meeting point of two expanding powers. On 9th May 1945 in Arkhangelsk, canteen workers roll a huge wooden barrel through the street to prepare for the victory celebration. Smiles and aprons show how quickly a city of ration cards turned into a city of open-air toasts and dancing. On 25 November 1988, crowds fill the Nikolaev shipyard in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic to see the huge aircraft carrier Riga launched. This unfinished hull would later be renamed Varyag and finally become China's first aircraft carrier, Liaoning. A young East German man slips past guards and barbed wire to reach West Berlin in the early 1960s. images like this turned the concrete border into a global symbol of people risking everything for a different life. In 1928, swimmers in heavy wool suits splash beside a narrow wooden pier at tiny Orange Beach, Alabama. Behind them, just a few wooden houses and a tree-shaded hotel hint at how small this Gulf town was before modern tourism arrived. Irish leader Michael Collins leans over a balcony and shouts to a packed crowd in Dublin in 1922. Just months later, he would die during the Irish Civil War at only 31 years old, turning this image into a farewell snapshot of a rising statesman. A young pilot from the all-female Soviet night bomber regiment stands by her aircraft, later nicknamed the Night Witches by German troops. Flying slow wood and canvas planes, they cut their engines and glided in near silence, which made their night raids feel ghostly and hard to track. In 1929, members of a Chicago gang were lined up against a warehouse wall in what became known as the St. Valentine's Day case. The daytime trap, carried out by men dressed as police, turned this quiet garage into one of the most famous crime scenes in American history. In 1958, Bath County officers stand behind rows of barrels and glass jugs after uncovering a hidden moonshine still. The seized stash shows how big the backwoods liquor trade remained even decades after Prohibition ended. In 1940, children in rural Kentucky skip school to gather around a steaming pan of boiling sorghum syrup between Jackson and Campton. For many families, syruping off in early fall was both a community party and the sweetest taste of the year. In July 1943, the huge aircraft carrier USS Yorktown squeezes through the narrow Panama Canal, with sailors packed along the deck like a living railing. Moving ships this size between oceans in wartime turned the canal into one of the most strategic shortcuts on Earth. In the South Pacific during the World War II, a big LST landing ship lowers its ramp, while a Marine Corps truck rumbles aboard under the watch of the crew. Above them, fat barrage balloons float like guard dogs in the sky, ready to snag any low-flying enemy plane. In the late 1890s, British inventor F.R. Sims tests his tiny motor Scout, a petrol-powered quadricycle with a Maxim weapon mounted on the front. This odd machine, driven by a 1.5 horsepower engine, is often called the grandfather of modern armored cars and tanks. Around 1919, Medal of Honor recipient Alvin York stands in uniform beside his mother outside their simple home in Pall Mall, Tennessee. Just a few years earlier, he was an unknown backwoods farmer. Now he is one of the most decorated United States Army soldiers of the First World War. In May 1943, Navy divers climb out of the flooded wreck of battleship USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor, still resting on the harbor floor after the 1941 attack. Covered in oil and wearing gas mask-style gear, they salvage weapons and hardware so the ship's metal can fight on in new vessels. Sailors of the carrier USS Yorktown, CV-5, hurry across a sharply listing flight deck as they prepare to abandon ship during the Battle of Midway, 4 June 1942. Though mortally damaged by bombs and torpedoes, Yorktown stayed afloat long enough to help secure one of the turning points of the Pacific War. Salvage crews swarm over the sunken battleship USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor on 25 February 1942, pumping out and dismantling her 2 aft main turrets. Parts from these damaged gun houses were carefully recovered for study and reuse as the U.S. Navy absorbed hard lessons from the surprise attack 3 months earlier. A native elder stands with a wolf in front of a teepee in this often circulated late 19th century style photograph. Whether fully authentic or partly staged, it echoes how many indigenous cultures viewed wolves as loyal partners and guardians rather than threats. An Inuit woman sits on the frozen sea, working a handmade ice fishing line with 2 simple sticks as her tools. Rigs like this could pull up enough fish to feed a whole family through the polar winter. Navajo code talkers sit together on their homeland decades after using their language as a hidden radio code in World War II. Over 400 of these Marines sent messages the enemy never cracked, guiding U.S. forces through Pacific Island battles like Iwo Jima in 1945. Cowboys guide a sea of longhorn cattle across the Great Plains during a massive trail drive in the late 1800s. Herds this size could stretch for miles, feeding booming railroad towns and turning the open range into big business. In 1948, wildlife crews parachuted 76 beavers into remote Idaho forests to restore damaged wetlands. An incredible 75 furry paratroopers survived the journey, and their dams still shape those valleys today. Rows of freshly dug graves of the 4th Marine Division cover the black sand of Iwo Jima in March 1945, just weeks after the fighting ended. Nearly 7,000 U.S. sailors and Marines were laid here in this temporary cemetery, a stark measure of how costly that tiny island was. In the 1950s, Chrysler built gigantic V8-powered air raid sirens that screamed at about 138 decibels and could be heard up to 16 miles away. Only a handful of these nuclear attack warning monsters survive today as silent museum pieces or rusty rooftop relics. In March 1937, a leaking gas line triggered a massive blast at a Texas school in New London, where nearly 300 children and teachers lost their lives in one of America's worst classroom disasters. The shock was so great that even a notorious European dictator sent a formal note of sympathy to the town. Joyce Diane became the first woman to win the 1950s game show, The $64,000 Question, stunning America with her calm mastery of impossibly hard questions. Producers had actually tried to block her by picking topics they thought were far beyond her ability, but she coolly answered everyone and took the top prize anyway. During Prohibition, U.S. authorities ordered industrial alcohol supplies laced with harsh chemicals so bootleg liquor would be undrinkable. Historians estimate that this tainted booze caused thousands of unsuspecting Americans to lose their lives or suffer severe illness. Surrealist painter Salvador Dali became friends with comedian Harpo Marx and sent him a harp strung with barbed wire and decorated with spoons and forks. Harpo posed cheerfully with the bizarre instrument, his fingers wrapped in bandages after trying to actually play Dali's dangerous masterpiece. Ferruccio Lamborghini was a successful tractor manufacturer who once went to Enzo Ferrari to complain about the clutch in his Ferrari. After Ferrari allegedly dismissed him as just a tractor man, Lamborghini decided to build his own V12 Grand Tourers, and their rivalry reshaped Italian supercars. This claim is exaggerated. V2 rockets used a mix of ethanol and liquid oxygen, and the ethanol often came from fermented potatoes and other crops. It didn't literally take 30 tons of potatoes per rocket, though the program did divert large amounts of food-grade alcohol from civilian use. The text is generally accurate. Airframe icing was a serious problem for all air forces in W-1 including the Soviets, because ice increased weight, ruined lift, and could cause crashes. Ground crews really did scrape and knock ice off aircraft by hand in extreme cold, often several times a day.